Welcome Life Science learners to another installment of Life Sciences for you. Trust that you guys are well and looking forward towards our lesson. Let's look at what we're doing today. Guys, we're focusing on nutrition today. In our lesson, we're going to look at the organs, and in that we're going to look at their functions. And also we're going to spend some time looking at two important processes in digestion. The process of ingestion as well as the process of digestion in terms of what happens to food. So let's get straight into the lesson and have an overview of the main concepts and then look at some terminology. I must remind you that this section has a lot of important terms. Terms that range from parts to enzymes to products that are produced. And hence I suggest that you start preparing your vocab list of all these important terms. Let's get straight into these terms and look at them. And as I do that, I trust that you will write down these terms and have a list so that you can refer to them whenever you need to in preparation of an assessment. So let's get straight into the core concepts of our lesson. As I mentioned, it's important that we review what the core concepts are. We're going to spend some time overviewing the process of digestion. We're going to spend some time looking at what are the important organs in our digestive system. We're going to talk about their functions and their role in the process of digestion. And then we're going to pay special attention to two processes, the process of ingesting food and then what happens when food is ingested during the process of digestion. Right. It's important that a whole list of terms are put up on the board that you must refer to. These terms, again, are integral to you understanding processes, parts, and their function. So let's look at these now. Okay, so the process of mastication, another word for mastication is to chew food. And we often use the word chewing of food, but that refers to essentially the physical breakdown of food that happens when it enters the mouth. We're going to mention the term enzyme, and if you recollect, enzymes have specific functions in the body. And in this case, we're going to look at how enzymes speed up or catalyze certain reactions. And that is so that we can have the processes efficiently taking place. We're also going to talk about emulsion, which is basically a fine dispersion of tiny droplets. So we'll talk about what happens to fat droplets during the process of digestion. Carbohydrates, again, is a group of enzymes that are important in the digestion of carbohydrates, which are your simple sugars. We're going to mention proteases, which digest the meat and the proteins to the building blocks called amino acids. Lipase, a group of enzymes that catalyze the breakdown of lipids and fats. The concept of what the lacteal is when we look at the villi, which is again the structures in the small intestine that help us absorb the nutrients. And then the process of removal of excess amino acids called deamination. We're going to mention the concept of what metabolism, again, it refers to all the processes that take place, all the chemical reactions that take place in the body. We're going to talk about the villi as an adaptation in the lining of the small intestine, and we will spend some time looking at that structure in detail. In our focus today will be these two concepts of ingestion and digestion. So ingestion essentially is the taking in of food. The process of breaking that down is referred to as digestion, and we will look at that either being a physical process or a chemical process using enzymes. What happens to that food would be then either absorbed and then it's built up. So assimilate would be to put together into the cells based on how the body needs them, and then the removal of the waste products, the parts that are not digested, that's referred to as egestion or defecation. And finally, we got the last set of important terms, the concept of what is the bolus. Again, when we chew food and that food mixes with saliva in our mouth and we swallow, that ball-like mixture of food with saliva that moves down the throat is called the bolus. The concept of the importance of bile being produced by the liver and how it plays an important role in the digestion of fats in the small intestine. The concept of the exocrine and endocrine gland, which is the pancreas, and those are the functions of the pancreas, which produces enzymes as well as it produces hormones. We also will spend some time looking at the concept of peristalsis, which is again the movement of food from the esophagus all through the digestive system, and then the concept of what is chyme. And chyme again is a mixture of secretions of food and gastric juices from the stomach. Sure guys, so a lot of terms. Okay, let's have an overview of what is nutrition. So nutrition is the biochemical and physiological processes by which an organism uses food to support its life. It includes ingestion, which is taking in the food, digestion, breaking down the food, absorbing the building blocks, then assimilating them, putting them together based on what the cells need, and then the removal of the undigested or parts that are not needed. So that is nutrition. What are nutrients? So what is the purpose of us consuming food? We need to access the nutrients. Nutrients are needed for us to build, to repair, to grow. So nutrients are compounds found in food that provide us with energy, that facilitates growth and repair, and it helps us to carry out different life processes. So nutrients are important to all organisms being able to survive, live, reproduce, repair, and regenerate. So not all nutrients provide us with energy, but are necessary for some body functions. These can be divided into two groups: your macronutrients, which are needed in large quantities. So if you talk about things like proteins, your fats, your lipids, your carbohydrates, those are needed in large quantities and daily. However, we also need some micronutrients, and these are generally required in small amounts. And these can be the phosphorus, your calcium, your magnesium, potassium, that are needed in small amounts but still are crucial. Why is it that living things need energy? So we often feed because we need to take in foods that supply us with energy. Energy, again, is fundamental for all cells being able to carry out basic chemical reactions. So we need that food to provide us with energy, and energy is then used by the mitochondria to produce ATP, which is what's going to power the cells to carry out their functions. And so, as I mentioned, energy is, unlike matter, cannot be recycled. So an organism needs to constantly get energy supplied to it. So guys, we've looked at the core concepts. We've looked at an overview of the nutrition process. Let's have a little comfort break. Let's get re-energized, and when we get back, we will look at the digestive system and organs that make up the digestive system. See you in a little break. Get back soon. Welcome back, Life Science learners. Let's continue with our lesson. A recap of what we're doing today. We're looking at nutrition, and earlier on, we've spent some time looking at the basic concepts around nutrition. We looked at why nutrition is important, and we looked at some important terms. The list of terms were extravagant, they were long, but however, they are important, and hence I remind you to go back and to look at those. Let's move on with our lesson. Now we're focusing on the parts of the digestive system. It's important that when you learn any section, such as the alimentary canal or the digestive system, that you understand the location of an organ, its function, and a brief description of the organ. And essentially, that's what we're going to look at now. So we're going to look at the pathway of food as it moves through from the mouth all the way through to the anus, and we're going to try and identify the part, its structure, and its function. So let's get straight into that. So as I mentioned, we need to have an overview of the process of nutrition. Again, nutrition has 5 major processes. The process of ingestion, which is taking in the food, digesting the food, which would be both by chemicals and by physically breaking them down, which includes chewing. And as I mentioned, we then need to absorb all of those simple monomers or building blocks and take them into our cells, where they are then put together and assimilate. Assimilate essentially means to put together the building blocks based on what the body needs. And remember that, guys, when you consume a protein, whether it's a plant protein or an animal protein, the building blocks of both of these are simple amino acids. So the body breaks these down into the simple monomers or basic building blocks, which are amino acids, and then it takes them into the cells and converts those amino acids into specific proteins that the body needs. And that is what assimilation means. And so it does that with the carbohydrates, where it breaks them down into the simple monomers. It does that with our fats, and it arranges those based on what the body needs when physiological processes occur. Right. And then finally, the process of releasing what is not needed by the body or egesting them. Right. So again, it's a good illustration to show that process of what happens. So mechanical digestion occurs during digestion. Then the pieces of food are broken down using chemical digestion, as we mentioned there. We then see that the processes of these smaller molecules moving into the cells is referred to as absorption. And then finally, they are assimilated based on what the body needs to make what the cell uses. And then again, the undigested material is removed through the body. And that's essentially the pathway that food has to move through and the processes in the body. Right. It's important that we unpack what the organs are. There are two major groups of organs which make up the human digestive system. We refer to them as the alimentary canal, which is consisting of basically organs through which food will pass through. These include the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestine. We call this the alimentary canal. We also have organs that are associated with the alimentary canal called accessory organs. So accessory would essentially refer to things also associated with the digestive system. They may have other functions, but they're also associated and accessory to aid the process of digestion. So these accessory organs aid digestion, but do not actually contain food. And this can include the salivary glands, pancreas, liver, and the gallbladder. These organs, again, food does not physically pass through them, but produce substances or contribute to aiding in the process of food being broken down in the alimentary canal. It's important that when we look at the alimentary canal, we know that from the point that food enters to the point where it is digested, we refer to that as the pathway of food along the alimentary canal. Right. So here's a very intricate diagram that has both the organs of the digestive system or the alimentary canal along with organs that are associated with it. So as we go through them, it's important that when you have a diagram like this, that you look at the overview of the diagram, identify the parts, and then use that to unpack each part and their function. So let's start with the mouth. So the mouth is the organ in which food enters or is brought through during ingestion. We've got teeth in there, and we've discussed the structure of teeth in the past, and we looked at the composition of the different teeth and how they play an important role in chewing and the mixing of the food with saliva and breaking that down physically. So in the mouth, you've got teeth, you've got the mouth cavity in which the food is mixed up with saliva. And saliva is produced by the salivary glands, and these are present in the body, and there are 6 pairs of salivary glands underneath the tongue and further up on the side of your cheekbones. Okay. The food then passes through into the pharynx, which is an opening that allows for food to enter the esophagus. The esophagus is a tube that connects the mouth to an important organ called the stomach. It is in the stomach that the process of chemical digestion continues. And so we have the stomach, which is a muscular bag in which the food mixes with all the enzymes in the stomach to start the process of chemical digestion. In the background of this, we have a leaf-like structure called the pancreas, and that plays an important role in obviously the production of enzymes for digestion as well as production of hormones. We then move from the pancreas and the small part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. So we start off with the small intestine that moves through and opens up into the large intestine. The small intestine consists of three parts: the duodenum, the middle jejunum, and the last part that connects to the large intestine called the ileum. Okay? We then find that that connection between the ileum and the colon is present here with a little structure that is remnant of an organ that we had in the past. And that little structure there is the appendix, which is not labeled here, but that is the first bit of the large intestine. The large intestine is made up of different areas, and we call that the ascending colon. Again, that's the part that moves up. We have the transverse colon, which moves across, and then we have the descending colon that further carries the waste products down. And then finally, the digestive system ends with the rectum, with the anus being the part at which the food is then released, or the undigested bits are released. Further up, we need to talk about the liver, which is this triangular shaped structure, which has on it the gallbladder. I know it's a bit difficult for you to see in red, but as we move through this, I will change the color of my pen. Right, so let's look at each part and their function. So when we talk of the mouth cavity consists of many parts, right? So when we talk about it, we have the teeth which are present, and they're basically there to break down and to grind the food. And that we see significantly important in chemically allowing the food to be able to digest faster. So the more we chew our food, the better the chemical digestion takes place. Essentially, it means that chewing the food breaks down the food into smaller particles so that the process of chemical digestion becomes much more efficient as food moves along the alimentary canal. We also have the tongue, which is a muscular organ that allows for the food to mix with saliva, and that facilitates the easiest swallowing of food. The mouth also consists of a hard and soft palate, which forms the roof of the mouth. So the roof of the mouth, as you look up here, that hard part in which you often can touch and feel, that's the hard palate, and further back we have the soft palate. We also have three pairs of salivary glands, and these release saliva, which again contain enzymes which chemically break down your carbohydrates. So the first process of chemical digestion starts in the mouth, where the salivary glands produce an enzyme called amylase, which starts the production of enzymes to digest carbohydrates. And that's an overview of just the mouth. We then move from the mouth into the pharynx and the esophagus. So when we look at the pharynx here, and then we look at the tube that carries down the food to the stomach, we call that the esophagus. So after food is swallowed, basically it's now called the bolus. So that little ball of food that is chewed up into this round ball which is mixed with saliva is known as the bolus. It moves through the pharynx, which is a tube which takes it to the esophagus. The pharynx is a common tube that allows for air along with food to pass through. Just in front of the pharynx we have an opening called the trachea, which takes air down into the lungs. Behind the trachea we have the esophagus. What separates the opening between the trachea and the esophagus carrying food down into the stomach is a flap called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is a little flap that prevents food from moving into the trachea. Okay. From there the food moves down to the larynx, where there is a cartilaginous flap, as I mentioned, which stops the food from going into the trachea. Food then moves down into the esophagus to the stomach, and it is pushed along the way by a process called peristalsis. And peristalsis is an important process which we will discuss in detail in a little while. Okay, Then we move on to the stomach, and if you go back to where the food has come through, it moves from the esophagus into the stomach, and there's a little valve here that allows for food to move in, as well as a valve at the bottom end which allows food to leave the stomach. In the stomach, you'll find that the food then is mixed, or another word for mixing is churning, and it's mixed with strong enzymes and digestive juices that allow for the breakdown of protein. So in the stomach, we've got gastric juices and enzymes, specifically called hydrochloric acid. And you would have heard of hydrochloric acid as being a very strong acid. And essentially, it's an important part of the digestive system which helps in protein breakdown, but also serves an important mechanical barrier that allows for the destruction of pathogens and germs that may enter our food. When that food mixes with the enzymes and the digestive juices, it is now called chyme. And so we find that that mixture of gastric juices with the food and the enzymes from the stomach is called chyme. The stomach has two sphincters or valves, as I said. These are pointed out here at the opening between the stomach and the duodenum, as well as the opening between the esophagus and into the stomach. And these muscles basically close and keep both the openings to the stomach closed when food is being digested. So essentially, it allows for food to enter into this muscular organ, and it closes up and it contains the food for a little while until that churning and mixing occurs, and then it allows for the food to move through. Finally, we look at the small intestine, which consists of three regions. It has the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And if we focus in on this, that's the first part, which is the part that connects to the stomach. Then we've got the middle part called the jejunum. Again, it's quite folded and coiled. And then the last bit, the ileum, which connects to the large intestine. The jejunum is the middle portion which we discussed, and the ileum is the part that connects to the large intestine. The small intestine on the internal surface has got transverse folds that are lined with microscopic villi, and these villi basically are on the inside that increase the surface area for enzyme activity. The large intestine essentially consists of three parts. You've got the ascending colon, so it moves up. The transverse colon moving across. Food then moves down. The descending colon, where it is temporarily stored in the rectum. And then it ends off with food being released through the anus. Guys, I mentioned earlier on that we also need to discuss the accessory glands. And so, as we wrap up, the accessory glands, again, where the salivary glands in the mouth producing saliva, the pancreas, an important organ that produces enzymes as well as hormones that play an important role in regulating the blood sugar levels. The liver and the gallbladder, again, are important glands that produce bile and release the bile, and also play an important role in removing waste products and excess amino acids. We also know that bile has a number of functions in the process of digestion, which we will look at in detail, from aiding in emulsifying fat droplets to neutralizing acidic fluid that comes from the stomach into the small intestine, and it also acts as an antiseptic to help destroy some bacteria or pathogens that might enter along with food. And so, as we wrap up, it's important that we look at this as an overview of the digestive system and look at each organ and their function, and as well as to note the pathway that food moves through. Well guys, that's a wrap for this segment. We've just looked at the organs. Trust that you're able to identify organs and know their locations. Let's have a little comfort break, and when we get back, we can look at the further processes of digestion. Welcome back, Life Science learners. Let's continue with our lesson. A recap of where we are. Today we're focusing on nutrition, and we've discussed already the process of nutrition. In our segment now, we're going to focus on the process of ingestion and digestion. What does ingestion mean? It's important for us to understand how this happens and where it takes place. And then we will look at the process of digestion and what that means in terms of food physically being digested. We will look at the chemical process of digestion along with the mechanical process of where food is broken down. Right, so as I mentioned, ingestion. We often refer to us as, let's go and ingest our food. No, we don't actually say that, nah. We say, let's go and have a meal, let's eat. And that is essentially in reference to food being introduced into the mouth. So, the next time you're having a meal, you can say, well, I'm ingesting my meal. What does that mean? It means the process of taking food into the body through an act of eating. The question that I have to you is that, do all organisms eat? Well, if you don't have a mouth, how do you consume food? Well, let's remember that not every organism has a mouth through which it takes in food. Some of our unicellular organisms absorb food through their surfaces. We've discussed in the past how an amoeba will engulf its food and ingest the food. So a mouth is an adaptation in much more developed organisms for ingesting food. But not all organisms have a distinct mouth when we talk about the process of ingesting food. Right, so the large molecules found in intact food cannot pass through the cell membranes. So we will say that food needs to be broken down into smaller particles so that animals can harness the nutrients and then the organic molecules. The process of nutrition is to be able to bring in nutrients into the body. But remember that nutrients are often in complex states when we consume food. And so that needs to go through a process of being broken down into the most simplest monomers or building blocks that then can be absorbed. Right, so ingestion once in the mouth, the teeth, the saliva, as well as the tongue play an important role in a process called mastication. I mentioned this word before. Mastication is essentially the chewing of food. It's a complex word that describes the process of chewing. And that prepares the food into a ball of a ball that is softened with saliva of the food mass that then moves through. Mastication or chewing is extremely important because it aids in the food being broken down, especially when it comes to consuming fruits and vegetables, as these have indigestible cellulose, and these coats must be physically broken down in order for us to release the nutrients. Now guys, we don't have the enzyme cellulase to break down some of the plant material, and hence chewing the food allows for the nutrients to be physically released from within the cells. So remember to chew your food well. That helps you to further increase the digestion process, but also it allows you to maximize the nutrients that you get from your food. So when your parents do ask you to eat slow and chew your food, there's a lot of significance in that from a biological perspective. So remember that fact. So what happens during the process of digestion? Again, digestion refers to breaking down the food. This process can occur either mechanically as well as chemically. So let's look at mechanical digestion. The food is physically broken down into smaller fragments by the acts of chewing and churning and segmentation in the intestine. So what that means that there is a chemical process of digestion, but there is a mechanical process that we must refer to. Chewing the food breaks the food down. When it moves into the stomach, there's also the churning of food with enzymes, and that churning you often see sometimes, and you hear your stomach grumble, and that's the mixing of the food with the enzymes. That's a mechanical process, guys. And then when food moves into the small intestine, it continues a mechanical process of digestion where it is mixed and it's pushed along, and that process is all regarded as digestion that is mechanically assisted. Let's go back to chewing food. As I mentioned, it allows us to break down the food by the grinding action of our teeth. When food is swallowed, guys, it moves down, and the epiglottis that opens between the trachea and the esophagus prevents the bolus, which is that ball of food, entering the trachea, while the uvula, which is the flap that hangs from the upper part of your palate, that prevents the bolus from entering the nasal cavity. So sometimes when you drink fast, you find that sometimes you can actually get the water up into your nasal passage. It is the uvula that actually stops the water or food moving up into your nasal pharynx. Okay. The bolus then moves down the esophagus through a process called peristalsis. Okay. The mechanical digestion is a physical breakdown of the large food particles. We do not alter the chemical structure, but what it does is that physically increases the surface area so that more surface area is available for the enzymes to start breaking down smaller particles. And that is the idea behind chewing our food. Right, and we discussed the importance of teeth and how they are found. So we've got the teeth that help to bite the food. We've got the molars and premolars that play an important role in the physical process of chewing. The process of peristalsis is an important process. Food has to move through the digestive system, and this refers to the rhythmic contraction and relaxation of the muscles along the alimentary canal. I'm going to very quickly show you an image of what I mean. So guys, that's the bolus that's moving down the esophagus. We note that there are muscles that contract, whereas these muscles further ahead relax. So the blue arrows point to the contraction, and the green arrows point to the relaxation. So when these muscles contract, it pushes and opens up the esophagus, allowing for the food bolus to move through, while further down below the bolus, the muscles relax. And this movement of contraction and relaxation here allows for food to move through this tube. And so we talk about this important process of peristalsis allowing you to be able to digest your food even if you were standing on your head. So guys, the last bit of the chemical or the physical process of digestion is churning. And churning again is the mixing of the food with the enzymes in the stomach. And that's an important process where the food spends quite a bit of time in the stomach being churned and mixed with the gastric juices before it moves into the duodenum. Again, that is an important process of preparing the food for the next process of digestion. And as we wrap this segment up, guys, let's have a little break, and when we get back, we will look at the process of chemical digestion of food. So see you in a bit, grab some snacks, and when you get back, we will digest those with chemical digestion. See you in a bit. Welcome back, life science learners. Let's continue with our lesson. A recap of where we are. We're focusing on nutrition today, and in that process we're looking specifically at the process of ingestion and digestion. We've discussed already the physical process of digestion. Let's now focus on chemical digestion. Remember that chemical digestion involves the process of enzymes and other chemicals that assist in breaking down the food. The objective of chemical digestion is to be able to break down complex food molecules into the simplest molecules. This is then going to be absorbed in the next process. So after chemical digestion, we have absorption. It's important that we recognize that absorption takes place of the simplest monomers or building blocks of our organic molecules. So the best way to break them down is to use enzymes and chemicals to reduce them to their monomers, and then these are absorbed. So having said that, let's go into the process of chemical digestion and unpack what are the enzymes, what are the substrates they work on, and how they are broken up into the simplest monomers. Right, so as I mentioned, chemical digestion is the breakdown of large food compounds into smaller food molecules by digestive enzymes. We spoke about that firstly being broken down by mechanical digestion into smaller bits. Now we're moving from these smaller bits into breaking them up further into even smaller bits, and that's where we want to get to. We want to get to looking at how these are then absorbed as their simple monomers into the bloodstream. So most food particles are too large to be absorbed from the alimentary canal, and hence it needs to be chemically digested, and that's essentially the important part that we're looking at. To assist all of this, we have enzymes. Enzymes are very sensitive to changes in temperature, pH, and only work in an optimal temperature and pH range. Having said that, we've got to understand that throughout the digestive system and the alimentary canal, from the mouth down through the esophagus into the stomach, we have different pHs. What does this mean? It means that the enzymes that function in these different organs or parts have to be very sensitive or adapted to specific pHs. So in the mouth, we've got enzymes that break down your carbohydrates, and the pH in the mouth is slightly alkaline. However, when we move to the stomach, the pH changes radically. As we mentioned early on, the pH in the stomach is highly acidic, and so that enzyme nature has to be an enzyme that functions at an acidic pH. It's important that we recognize how the body has structurally suited itself or adapted itself for this process of chemical digestion in the alimentary canal, where there are significant changes in the pH along the digestive system. So let's look at the table below that provides a summary of the action of the enzymes. As I mentioned earlier on, it's important that you make notes of these. This is an important section in chemical digestion, where we look at the enzymes, we look at what are the substances that they target, and what happens when they break these down in terms of the products. Right, so the table below shows the different enzymes, where they are produced. Again, it's important to understand where they are produced, the substrates in terms of what they target and they break down, and then the optimal pH and the end products. So it's quite a comprehensive table, and the best way to learn these enzymes or to have an overview of the different enzymes is to be able to refer to such a table. Again, it talks about the enzyme, the substrate, its preference of pH, and then finally the monomers that these complex molecules are broken down into. So as I mentioned, we're going to look at these groups of enzymes. We're going to look at the carbohydrates, the enzymes that break down proteins, and the enzymes that break down lipids. So these are our major groups of organic compounds: carbohydrates, proteins, and your lipids. Okay, so when we talk of your carbohydrates, they are produced firstly in the mouth. So we have saliva that contains your carbohydrates. Salivary amylase is a group of carbohydrate breaking down enzymes. We also have them produced by the pancreas, as well as in the intestine. So the pancreas releases pancreatic juices into the duodenum, and we also know that the intestine releases enzymes that help in the digestion of your carbohydrates. Okay. The substrate that these enzymes work on would be carbohydrates. So all of these saliva, pancreatic juices, and your intestinal juices contain enzymes that break down your carbohydrates and your complex starch. The preferred pH for all of these enzymes is slightly alkaline, so above 7, so this could be between 7 to 9, and that's slightly alkaline, where the chemical digestion of your carbohydrates take place. And finally, all of the carbohydrates are broken down into the simplest monomers called glucose. And it is then that the glucose can be absorbed into the bloodstream. Okay, so if we were to look at that again, the enzymes produced that break down carbohydrates are in the saliva, in the pancreas, as well as from the small intestine. Again, they target your complex carbohydrates such as starch. It also breaks down your disaccharides in terms of into the simplest monomers, which we know is glucose. The next group of organic compounds we're looking at are called your proteins. And proteins are broken down by a group of enzymes called proteases. Again, remember that the suffix ases often refers to enzymes that assist in breaking down. So your proteases target your proteins. So we have the first process of protein digestion starts in the stomach, where the churning of the food with the gastric juices produces chyme. We also see that the pancreas produces some important protein digesting enzymes, along with the intestine producing enzymes that are responsible for protein digestion. The substrate that all of these target would be proteins, and so we find that in the stomach, the large protein molecules, so your beans, your meat, your fish, your steak, are mixed with the digestive juices and then broken down into smaller polypeptides. Okay? These then move into the stomach and the small intestine, where the pH changes radically. As I mentioned, the pH in the stomach is acidic, so the gastric juices producing hydrochloric acid allow for those protein digesting enzymes to function optimally. However, when the chyme moves into the small intestine, we see a change in pH now that becomes alkaline. So it's between 7 to 9. It means that there's a radical change from being acidic in the stomach to being alkaline in the duodenum. So to be able to assist this, we have the pancreatic juices that produce the alkaline enzymes to adjust the temperature, and that moves from now the stomach into the small intestine. And finally, your proteases, as I mentioned, protein digesting enzymes, breaks down proteins into the simplest molecules called amino acids. It is these amino acids that then travel along the digestive system, absorbed into the bloodstream, and then move into cells where they're used for protein synthesis in a process called assimilation, or putting them together. And finally, the last group of organic compounds are your lipids, and these enzymes that break down lipids are called lipases. So lipid digesting enzymes are called lipases. The lipases are produced by the pancreatic juices in the pancreas, along with the intestinal juices produced in the intestine. These enzymes target the lipids, and remember that lipids are made up of fatty acids and glycerol, so these break them down into smaller molecules of fatty acids and glycerol. These enzymes all function in an alkaline medium. So from the mouth into the digestives, into the stomach, we saw that it was very acidic. From the duodenum further through the alimentary canal, the small intestine and the large intestine, we see that the pH now is back to alkaline, which is slightly above 7 to about 9. And finally, the building blocks that fats are broken up into would be your fatty acid and your glycerol molecules. And it is these molecules that are then absorbed in the small intestine and transported to where the body needs them, and they're absorbed. Right. So this is essentially what we've just looked at as a larger image. Let's look at the chemical digestion of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids as an overview. So as I mentioned, your protein molecules are complex molecules made up of different types of amino acids. During the protein digesting process, the proteases break down the peptide bonds into a series of steps, releasing the simplest monomers called amino acids. And so that completes the protein digestion, where amino acids are released. A starch molecule, again, is a complex carbohydrate made up of many glucose molecules. Your carbohydrases break down the glucose molecules, releasing each monomer, and these glucose molecules are then available for absorption in the bloodstream. As we mentioned earlier on, a fat molecule is made up of fatty acid and glycerol molecules. Again, lipases break down the ester bonds, causing them to be broken up into the glycerol and fatty acid molecules, which then move into the bloodstream to be absorbed and used where needed. Let's look at the overview of this. So as I mentioned, the esophagus in the mouth, you find salivary amylase being produced, and that then travels down the esophagus. In the stomach, we've got your proteases, which break down proteins into polypeptides. Polypeptides are smaller molecules that make up proteins. We know that in the stomach, chemical digestion takes place, and this mixture of food along with that is called chyme. And so those digestive juices from the stomach with food is called chyme. The chyme then moves into the small intestine, which is the duodenum, along with enzymes produced by the pancreatic duct, then mix with the chyme to neutralize that pH. So the pancreas then produces amylase, lipase, protein digesting enzymes, your nucleic acid digesting enzymes called nucleases, as well as your bicarbonate ions, and those are enzymes and ions that neutralize the pH from acidic chyme into an alkaline secretion. We also see that then the food is then broken up further in the small intestine as we look at that further. Let's not forget the function of the liver. The liver produces bile salts, which are temporarily stored in the gallbladder, which are then released via the bile duct into the duodenum that helps in fat digestion. So guys, as we wrap this segment up, it's important that we have an overview of the application of some of these concepts. So I've put a few questions together as we wrap this segment up. Let's see if we can apply what we've just looked at. So the question refers to the following image that I've got here up on the board. Study the diagram of the digestive system and answer the questions that follow. So we've got a diagram that has various different parts labeled on it. Provide labels for parts A to K and 11 marks. Guys, this sort of question is a very good question to be able to revise this section. I'm going to give us a chance to do this together and to help you to recap some of those basic parts that we did. As I mentioned, use these diagrams to recollect structure and then also, along with that, annotate the function. So let's help me do this together. So we've got this tube that brings food down, and that tube there, A, is the esophagus. And the esophagus, again, is that tube that allows for the ball of food to move into organ B, which is the stomach. So note, as I'm going through the digestive system, I'm making note of the different parts. The food then mixes with enzymes and then moves into part C, which is the duodenum. So it's the first part of the small intestine. This leaf-shaped organ here, which plays an important role in the production of enzymes and hormones, is called the pancreas. And that's the pancreas here, which produces hormones as well as enzymes. And finally, we've got structure. Here, structure E, which is the small intestine, and that's the middle bit of the small intestine. So you can call that the small intestine, which then moves food into the large intestine. Here we see that as the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and then E will be the descending colon, with finally food being temporarily stored in the rectum, where it is released through an organ called the anus. Further up here, the distinct shape of this triangular organ points to the liver, and this little small gland there is the gallbladder. Guys, that's a wrap for this segment. We've looked at the parts of the digestive system. We've looked at two important processes, ingestion as well as digestion. When we looked at digestion, we broke that up into the mechanical digestion, where food was mixed and chewed and churned. And then finally, we looked at chemical digestion of the three major organic groups in terms of how proteins are digested, how carbohydrates are digested, along with how lipids are digested. Guys, that's a wrap for me. Trust that you've enjoyed the lesson and that you're able to engage with this topic as you plan for your exams. From me, have a good day. See you soon. Cheers.